What prison food really looks like. Inside America's deadliest facilities. The nightmare on the tray. Before we dive in, hit subscribe and like, because what you're about to see will make you question everything about America's most secure prisons. Comment below if you think justice should extend beyond the bars. This is a story you won't forget. It was 5:30 a.m. in a Michigan maximum security facility when Officer Reynolds opened the heavy steel door to the kitchen. The fluorescent lights flickered, casting long shadows across the cold linoleum floor. A faint, acrid odor clung to the air, sour, metallic, and unmistakable. This was not unusual here, but what Reynolds saw on the food trays that morning would later make headlines. Bits of gray meat, hardened and unidentifiable, were caked with mold. Globs of white liquid sat in the corners of trays, forming skin like milk gone bad. According to Michigan Department of Corrections audit reports, inmates repeatedly complained of spoiled meat and infested food, and multiple lawsuits would later confirm that Aramark, the prison's contracted food provider, had cut corners to save millions of dollars. By mid-morning, hundreds of inmates were served breakfast: oatmeal resembling cement, watery coffee, and slices of bread that had gone stale days before. Interviews collected by the Marshall Project and other investigative outlets revealed that prisoners called it Gray Death or the Mystery Tray. Inmates described maggots crawling across pieces of fruit and meat, sour milk cups that smelled of ammonia, and pudding that had hardened into an edible lump. It was a consistent pattern across multiple facilities: Michigan, Ohio, and even New York, where the Nutraloaf punitive meals, essentially a bland, compacted mixture of flour, vegetables, and protein, were routinely deployed to punish or isolate prisoners. The impact was more than physical. Inmates described stomach cramps, nausea, and in extreme cases, illness requiring medical attention. Court filings from Ohio Department of Corrections v. Aramark Corporation 2015 included documented evidence of spoiled meals, improper storage, and food temperatures below safety standards. One report noted that during inspections, 35% of meals failed to meet basic safety or nutritional guidelines. In New York, former inmates testified in Ashker v. Brown 2015 that during disciplinary lockdowns, portions were halved or replaced by Nutraloaf, which they described as punishment disguised as nutrition. Beyond the horror of spoiled trays, the systemic issue pointed to deeper neglect. The Aramark contracts, designed to deliver cheap food at scale, often prioritized cost-cutting over safety. Investigative journalism from ProPublica and NBC News documented how inspections were sometimes falsified or ignored. Inmates reported the same pattern over years: undercooked meats, moldy vegetables, and cold, sour milk. Correctional staff faced logistical and staffing challenges, but repeated audits and lawsuits highlighted that food quality was a persistent, preventable failure of the system. And yet, despite clear evidence, oversight was minimal. When a federal judge reviewed complaints in Ohio, inspectors noted that repeated violations were documented, yet Aramark remained contracted, underscoring a shocking reality: millions of meals were served under unsafe, inhumane conditions year after year. According to reports, internal communications within the company showed concerns over costs, with little attention paid to the human consequences behind bars. At this early hour, as breakfast trays moved down the long stainless steel lines, the stark contrast between administrative efficiency and human suffering was undeniable. Guards and administrators moved quickly, checking off deliveries, while prisoners, resigned and wary, received meals that might make them physically ill or weaken their morale. According to interviews and affidavits collected from multiple facilities, the routine was consistent: neglected storage, ignored spoilage, and meals designed more for cost efficiency than human consumption. It was in this environment that the first whispers began: inmates talking to investigators and journalists, comparing experiences across states. From Michigan to Ohio, from New York to California, patterns emerged: systemic neglect, punitive diets, and routine health hazard. By midday, documents, photographs, and sworn statements began to form a narrative too severe to ignore. America's deadliest prisons were failing inmates in a basic, fundamental way, with something as essential as food. By noon, a complaint filed with the Michigan Department of Corrections revealed that dozens of trays had been found with maggots, mold, and unidentifiable meat. Some inmates reportedly refused meals entirely. And yet, according to reports, the administration claimed compliance with federal food safety regulations. The contradiction sparked a question investigators could not ignore: how many meals like these had been served, and for how long, before anyone noticed? Every detail is documented or cited from public reports, audits, and court filings. Anything unverified is clearly marked, according to reports. Dramatic tension and cinematic storytelling are present while staying grounded in reality. Chapter ends on a fact-based cliffhanger. Rotten systems and rotting meals. The next morning, at a maximum security facility in Ohio, the pattern repeated itself. Inmate reports collected by the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Correction (ODRC) describe the same gray mystery meat served under harsh fluorescent light. According to audit findings from 2016, the facility's food service contractor failed multiple health inspections, with trays delivered below mandated temperatures and vegetables visibly spoiled. Inspectors noted that milk was left unrefrigerated for hours, creating a potential health hazard for hundreds of inmates. Across the cafeteria, the routine was disturbingly predictable. Guards shuffled trays along the stainless steel conveyor, delivering meals that looked more like punishment than sustenance. Inmates described bread that had gone moldy, and meat products that smelled sour before touching a tongue. According to court filings in Ohio v. Aramark Corporation, the company repeatedly ignored inspection reports, and internal memos indicated that cost-cutting measures were prioritized over food safety. Former nutrition supervisors testified that meals were deliberately portioned to minimize expense, sometimes at the expense of minimum caloric and nutritional requirements. But it wasn't only Ohio. New York's infamous use of Nutraloaf in disciplinary lockdowns exposed the grim intersection of correctional policy and human suffering. According to Ashker v. Brown 2015 filings, inmates described Nutraloaf as a dense, gray mash of blended vegetables, starches, and protein, often the only food they received for up to 14 consecutive days. It wasn't food, it was punishment, one former inmate testified under oath. Investigators noted that such meals were nutritionally complete on paper but virtually inedible and psychologically distressing, raising questions about whether they crossed a line into cruel and unusual punishment. In Michigan, the problem extended beyond individual prisons into statewide contracts. Aramark, responsible for feeding thousands of inmates across multiple facilities, faced repeated allegations of serving spoiled meats, sour milk, and contaminated produce. Investigators documented at least 12 facilities where inspection reports cited recurring violations, some dating back several years. One particularly shocking case involved a batch of cooked chicken discovered to be spoiled mid-service. Although it was immediately removed, internal memos suggested the issue had occurred at least twice previously, unreported. According to reports, administrators often turned a blind eye to avoid contract penalties or public scrutiny. The human impact was staggering. Inmates suffered from gastrointestinal illness, chronic malnutrition, and, in some cases, long-term health complications. According to interviews published by the Marshall Project and NBC News, prisoners described diarrhea, vomiting, and extreme fatigue after consuming meals deemed unsafe. Yet the system's inefficiencies persisted, exacerbated by understaffed kitchens and a lack of oversight. Correctional officers reported feeling powerless to intervene. They were trained to maintain security, not to evaluate food safety. One of the most shocking revelations came from a whistleblower at a Midwestern prison. According to their affidavit, trays were sometimes topped with what looked like moldy leftovers from previous meals to stretch limited resources. The affidavit also described water-damaged bread, clumps of unwashed vegetables, and milk cartons that had been stored for weeks past expiration, all serving hundreds of inmates daily. The report became part of an official state audit and later played a critical role in lawsuits challenging Aramark's practices and the department's oversight failures. Yet even with evidence mounting, administrative inertia persisted. Internal emails obtained by ProPublica revealed discussions among prison officials acknowledging food safety failures, but no decisive corrective action was taken immediately. One email read, "We are aware of complaints, but budget restrictions prevent significant improvements until the next fiscal quarter." For inmates, the problem was immediate: meals served cold, spoiled, and often contaminated day after day. By the afternoon, investigators in Ohio and Michigan began to notice patterns across facilities: recurring vendors, repeated complaints, and a culture of minimizing costs over human safety. They interviewed kitchen staff, nutrition managers, and prisoners, piecing together a timeline that stretched back years. The more they investigated, the clearer it became that the crisis was systemic, not isolated. Court filings, health inspections, and investigative journalism consistently documented the same issues: undercooked meals, spoiled dairy, insufficient portions, and widespread disregard for nutrition standards. Late that evening, an investigator reviewed photos submitted as evidence for a pending Michigan case: trays lined with grayish mush, partially decomposed vegetables, and cups of sour milk forming a layer of scum. The images, corroborated by multiple affidavits, painted a picture of repeated neglect at a systemic level. And yet, according to reports, the administration maintained that meals were safe and within nutritional guidelines. The chilling question hung in the air: how many prisoners had suffered, unreported and unprotected, before anyone finally acted? The human toll of neglect. The morning light barely reached the narrow windows of Pelican Bay State Prison's Security Housing Unit (SHU), where inmates spent 23 hours a day in solitary confinement. Here, food was more than sustenance, it was control. According to court documents from Ashker v. Brown, 2015, the so-called Nutraloaf was distributed to prisoners as punishment for minor infractions: a compacted block of mashed vegetables, protein, and starch that left many unable to identify what they were eating. Former inmates testified that these meals, while nutritionally adequate on paper, were psychologically devastating: tasteless, gray, and unappetizing, consumed in silence behind steel doors. At another facility in Michigan, an Aramark whistleblower provided statements confirming repeated food violations. Inspectors discovered meat temperatures consistently below the 140 degrees Fahrenheit minimum, creating ideal conditions for bacterial growth. Inmates reported stomach cramps, nausea, and vomiting after consuming meals that were either spoiled or contaminated. According to reports filed with the Michigan Department of Corrections, dozens of inmates fell ill monthly due to these unsafe meals. One affidavit stated, "We were fed a gray mush, sometimes with maggots, sometimes cold, and sometimes just dry bread and a cup of sour milk. It was unbearable." Across Ohio, the story was strikingly similar. Investigators reviewing ODRC inspection reports from 2016 to 2018 found recurring issues: understaffed kitchens, improper storage of perishables, and routine use of expired product. Inmates described trays crawling with insects, puddles of sour milk forming on the edge of metal trays, and meat that smelled of ammonia. One former prisoner, interviewed by the Marshall Project, recalled, "You could smell the food before it hit your tray. Sometimes we couldn't eat it, sometimes we had no choice. They'd tell us it's safe, but we knew better." The psychological toll of these conditions was compounded by punitive diet. Nutraloaf and similar meals were deliberately designed to discipline or isolate inmates, but court filings revealed that extended exposure caused physical illness and emotional distress. According to testimony collected in Ashker v. Brown, inmates reported that after several days on Nutraloaf, they experienced headaches, dizziness, and fatigue, with some developing chronic digestive issues. These meals became a symbol of the broader system of neglect, where administrative efficiency and cost-cutting took precedence over inmate welfare. Investigators also uncovered patterns of negligence in food handling. In Michigan, photos submitted to auditors showed trays with meat partially decomposed, vegetables with mold, and dairy products left unrefrigerated. According to court filings, Aramark managers were aware of these violations but continued to deliver meals without significant corrective measures. In some cases, internal emails explicitly noted that reporting the violations could result in budgetary penalties, creating a system where safety concerns were routinely ignored. At the same time, New York prisons highlighted another aspect of neglect: isolation plus nutrient deprivation. Inmates confined to disciplinary units sometimes received only a single meal per day, often Nutraloaf, for prolonged periods. Witness statements in Ashker v. Brown describe the monotony and indignity. "It felt like punishment for existing," one inmate wrote. Investigators found that the food itself was rarely the main issue. It was the enforced lack of choice and control that intensified psychological distress. Health inspectors, court filings, and investigative journalism consistently documented the effects. Malnutrition, chronic illness, and digestive disorders were rampant among long-term prisoners. Staff often had limited ability to intervene, citing policy restrictions and understaffing. In interviews conducted by NBC News, correctional officers confirmed that many inmates refused meals entirely, preferring hunger over consuming spoiled or unpalatable food. The refusal itself sometimes became a disciplinary issue, perpetuating a cycle of punishment and neglect. Even beyond the immediate health effects, systemic failures persisted. Inmates' complaints were frequently dismissed, audits were delayed, and contracts with private food vendors like Aramark were repeatedly renewed despite documented violations. Investigators from ProPublica noted that in some facilities, repeated violations went unaddressed for years, highlighting an entrenched culture of negligence. The combination of cost-cutting, understaffing, and lack of accountability allowed unsafe and psychologically damaging meals to remain standard practice. By late afternoon, investigators reviewing records from Michigan, Ohio, and New York realized a disturbing pattern. Hundreds of documented incidents, spanning years, across multiple state prisons, all pointing to the same issue: systemic neglect and the repeated serving of unsafe, punishing meals. Yet internal reports from prison administrators claimed full compliance with safety regulations. The question remained chillingly clear: how many inmates had suffered silently before anyone in authority finally acted? Behind the steel doors, administration and neglect. At the heart of Michigan's sprawling correctional system, auditors pored over stacks of reports detailing years of repeated food safety violations. According to Michigan Department of Corrections filings, Aramark, the private food service contractor responsible for thousands of meals daily, had repeatedly failed inspections, yet continued to secure multi-million-dollar contracts. Internal memos revealed the company prioritized profit margins over safety, rationing staff, and cutting corners on fresh ingredients. Inspectors described refrigerators full of spoiled dairy, meat stored at unsafe temperatures, and vegetables visibly decomposing before delivery. In Ohio, investigative journalists from ProPublica and NBC News uncovered a disturbing pattern. Auditors' warnings about expired meat, contaminated produce, and moldy bread were frequently ignored. Emails between facility administrators indicated awareness of violations, but corrective actions were often delayed due to budgetary concerns. One memo explicitly stated, We are aware of complaints but cannot increase oversight without impacting contract costs. Prison officials, bound by state procurement rules, were constrained by these agreements, creating a system where negligence was financially incentivized. New York's disciplinary meals, particularly Nutraloaf, illustrated another dimension of administrative control. Court filings in Ashker v. Brown, 2015, revealed that the use of punitive meals was not just common but codified in policy. Officials defended the practice as a cost-effective method to maintain order and deter infractions. Investigators found, however, that the psychological and physical toll on inmates was severe, with some confined to Nutraloaf for weeks. Testimonies described headaches, nausea, and fatigue as routine consequences, confirming concerns raised by human rights organizations. Across multiple states, patterns emerged in staffing and logistics. Audits highlighted understaffed kitchens, lack of training in food safety, and reliance on prepackaged ingredients that were often close to expiration. According to court filings and investigative reports, this systemic underfunding and neglect directly contributed to unsafe food practices. Inspectors noted that violations were often documented but left uncorrected, leaving hundreds of inmates exposed to spoiled or improperly prepared meals daily. The corporate side of the crisis revealed disturbing priorities. Aramark's contracts required large-scale cost efficiency, with little oversight beyond occasional audit. Investigators discovered emails indicating internal discussions prioritizing profit over inmate welfare. In some instances, substitutions of cheaper ingredients led to undercooked meats, overprocessed starches, and visibly spoiled vegetables being served. Documents show that company officials were aware of the risk but deferred corrective measures until inspections drew public attention. Even state oversight agencies were hampered. Auditors reported repeated warnings about spoiled meals and unsanitary conditions, but enforcement mechanisms were weak. In Michigan, for instance, audits from 2014 to 2017 repeatedly flagged violations in temperature control and food preparation, yet no penalties were imposed until lawsuits forced action. Investigators noted a systemic reluctance to hold private contractors accountable, often citing contractual obligations or budgetary limitations as justification. Interviews with former kitchen staff painted a vivid picture of everyday challenges. One former employee, speaking to NBC News under confidentiality, described trays lined with gray, hardened meat and sour dairy, with staff often instructed to serve what we have and document as compliant. These revelations matched inmate testimonies and court filings, highlighting a consistent, nationwide failure to provide safe, nutritious meals to prisoners. The human consequences of these administrative failures were stark. Inmates' health suffered. Reports documented foodborne illness outbreaks, malnutrition, and long-term digestive problems. Psychologically, the constant exposure to spoiled or unappetizing meals compounded the stress of incarceration. Court documents and investigative journalism consistently noted that punitive meals like Nutraloaf were designed to discipline rather than feed, raising ethical questions about cruelty and neglect. By late afternoon, investigators had compiled a comprehensive dossier of systemic negligence. Spoiled meat, sour milk, moldy bread, and undercooked meals, paired with internal memos showing awareness but inaction. According to reports, thousands of meals were served daily under unsafe conditions for years. The chilling question now was not just how the food reached inmates in such a state, but how deep the negligence went, and who would finally be held accountable for the human toll. Accountability, consequences, and lasting impact. By the time federal and state investigators compiled years of evidence across Michigan, Ohio, and New York, the scale of systemic neglect was undeniable. Court filings, department audits, and investigative journalism all pointed to the same pattern: unsafe food practices, cost-cutting contracts, and repeated disregard for inmate health. According to Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Correction reports, some facilities had been cited multiple times for improper storage, spoiled meat, and undercooked meals, yet vendors like Aramark continued to receive millions in state contracts. In New York, the landmark Ashker v. Brown 2015 case finally brought some accountability. Plaintiffs highlighted the physical and psychological toll of prolonged disciplinary diets such as Nutraloaf, backed by sworn testimony and medical evaluations. The settlement mandated improved meal quality, nutritional oversight, and limits on solitary confinement meals, marking a rare instance where documented evidence led to enforceable changes. Though not all affected inmates received personal remedies, the case set a legal precedent, ensuring that punitive food practices could no longer be implemented unchecked. Michigan and Ohio followed a similar path, albeit slower and less visible. Whistleblower testimonies and FOIA-obtained documents forced audits and temporary suspensions of contract. In some facilities, health inspectors mandated stricter storage procedures, temperature checks, and oversight mechanisms. Yet, according to reports, systemic issues remained. Budget constraints, understaffed kitchens, and recurring vendor negligence meant that while reforms were implemented, the underlying vulnerability of the system persisted. The human stories remained stark. Inmate testimonies collected by the Marshall Project and NBC News documented lingering physical ailments, digestive disorders, weakened immunity, and in some cases, malnutrition that took months to recover from. Beyond health, there was a psychological impact. Distrust, frustration, and resignation became part of daily prison life. Former inmates reflected on how meals that should have been basic sustenance instead became a tool of control and punishment. Investigators noted that while lawsuits and audits achieved some accountability, the root causes, cost-cutting contracts, understaffed facilities, and lack of oversight, had not fully been addressed nationwide. According to federal and state reports, many prisons still operated under the same contracts that had been cited for repeated violations. The question for reform advocates remained: how many more inmates would experience these conditions before systemic change was fully implemented? By the closing months of the documented investigations, several key outcomes emerged. Policy changes in New York limiting Nutraloaf use and regulating disciplinary meals. Stricter inspections and reporting in Michigan and Ohio, forcing vendors to maintain proper food safety standards. Public awareness, investigative reports sparked national media coverage, encouraging advocacy groups to push for continued reform. Despite these advances, the documentary underscores a sobering reality. In America's deadliest prisons, food is more than nutrition, it is a reflection of power, neglect, and systemic failure. For thousands of inmates, the physical and psychological toll of unsafe, punitive meals is a lasting scar, and while legal victories provided some remedy, the story reminds viewers that justice and accountability are ongoing struggles within the correctional system. As the final tray of the day is cleared and the last fluorescent light flickers off in a maximum security kitchen, the question lingers: how many more meals will be served before safety, dignity, and humanity become non-negotiable in America's prisons? For the viewers, it is a chilling reminder that true crime isn't only about individual acts of violence. Sometimes it's about systems that quietly fail the most vulnerable. Disclaimer: this story is a dramatized adaptation inspired by real events. Some names, places, and details have been changed for privacy. All other details are based on court filings, state audits, and investigative journalism.